The vote passed at the 43rd minute of session 91, and I know that because I was the one keeping the record. I am, or was, 11 years, the senior records officer for the human delegation to the Vethani Accord Assembly. That means I sat in the chamber, scribed every procedural motion, and filed every instrument in the formats the Assembly's 900-year codex demanded. I was not a diplomat. I did not negotiate. My job was to watch, note, and preserve. By the end of session 91, I understood that this had made me the most dangerous person in the room. The Vethani Accord Assembly convened in the Hall of Converging Interests on the orbital platform above Sorval Prime, a vast, tiered chamber of pale stone and blue-lit procedural displays, with seating galleries that curved upward in a horseshoe and a floor reserved for potential delegations. 7 bodies held permanent seats. 11 held associate status. We held associate status. It had taken Earth 22 years of applications, appeals, and revised submissions to earn it. Presiding voice that cycle was a Velthian named Sorveth Oran. Tall, white-gray skin, cranial ridges that fanned forward when he was reading closely, and lay flat when he had already made up his mind. First 3 weeks of the session, those ridges lay flat every time he looked in our direction. The formal instrument was called a status nullification, a procedural mechanism the Assembly had used exactly 4 times in its 900-year history, always against parties that had committed treaty violations, egregious enough to warrant immediate removal. The motion cited no violation. It cited instead a clerical argument that Earth's original associate status documentation had been filed in the Assembly's tertiary registry rather than the primary, a distinction so technical that our own head of delegation, Ambassador Kira Dahl, had looked down at her notes for 2 full seconds when the motion was read aloud. 2 seconds. That was all. Then she looked up. The motion passed 14-3. The presiding voice struck the resonance bar, a formal instrument of pale hollow bone that the Velthians have, used to mark procedural completion for longer than our civilization has had writing. The sound it made was clean and final. Procedural display above the chamber floor updated. Earth's associate status credential line shifted from green to amber. Dahl did not stand. She did not gesture. She turned to me, and I slid the relevant page across the table. She had already read it, of course. We had both read the entire codex, but she gave it a moment's glance, nodded once, and laid it on the table between us. Article 7, Section 4 of the Vethani Accord Assembly Procedural Codex, as ratified in the 312th year of the Assembly's operation. Any party whose credentials are under active administrative dispute retains provisional floor access until the dispute is formally resolved by the duly convened adjudication panel. Provisional access carries no speaking rights but full observational standing and uninterrupted access to all floor-level instruments and filed documents. A status nullification, by its own procedural definition, constituted an active administrative dispute. A status nullification required an adjudication panel review before it could be made permanent. The adjudication panel had a 60-day convening window under Assembly standing orders. We were going to be here for another 60 days. Dahl set the page face down and folded her hands on top of it. I watched Sorveth Oran. I had been watching him for 3 weeks. I had learned to read those cranial ridges the way Father Fatah taught me to read shipping contracts. Not the headings, not the summary paragraphs, the indemnity clauses buried in Appendix 4, which were always where the real weight sat. The ridges fanned forward now meant he was reading something he hadn't expected to need to read. His protocol officer leaned to him and murmured. Oran's ridge fan tightened. He called a recess. The next 3 weeks were something I have no professional language for, because the word that fits isn't a diplomatic term. The word is scramble. The Assembly's Procedural Secretariat began a review of the adjudication panel convening process. They found, almost immediately, that the panel had not been formally constituted in 61 years. The last convening had concerned a disputed instrument from a since-dissolved associate member, and that the current panel roster was 9 members short of quorum by the Assembly's own appointment rules. Appointments required ratification by the full chamber. Full chamber ratification required a session day. Session days required advance notice of not fewer than 14 days. We watched this unfold from the floor. We watched it with the particular quality of attention that comes from having read every procedural document in the repository and said nothing about any of it. Dahl developed a habit during those weeks of arriving at the chamber exactly on time, setting her things out in the same order: documents left, stylus centered, water glass right, and reading. Not performing reading. Reading. She had brought 3 volumes of Assembly procedural history. Bound in the gray cloth covers the Assembly's own archive used for its reference, editions, and she worked through them the way someone works, through something they are genuinely interested in. The other delegations watched her. I watched the other delegations watch her. On the 18th day, the Keithian delegation's senior aide passed me in the corridor and asked quietly whether we required any support in locating archive materials. I told him we were managing well. He nodded slowly, with an expression I have since come to recognize as the particular look of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion they found uncomfortable. The Sorvelian observer delegation requested an informal session with us on the 22nd day. Dahl declined. She did it without a word. She looked up from her reading, shook her head once, and looked back down. The observer delegation's chair sat with that for a moment, then withdrew. 31st day, Sorveth Oren requested a private meeting through formal channels. Dahl declined, citing the Provisional Access Provision's prohibition on informal bilateral engagement outside the floor record during active dispute periods. She cited the exact subsection. I had found that subsection. It was in Appendix 12, which was, in the Assembly's own filing taxonomy, classified as a supplementary reference document rather than a primary procedural instrument, which meant it was not indexed in the main codex table of contents, and could only be located if you had read the appendix volumes separately. We had read the appendix volumes separately. Oren's protocol officer filed a formal objection to the declination. Dahl's response, filed through me, as required by the dispute period access provisions, noted that the objection itself was an informal bilateral engagement and therefore fell under the same prohibition. The protocol officer did not respond to that. At the 44th day, the panel appointment ratification was finally scheduled. 7 of the 9 required appointees cleared without controversy. The 8th candidate, a Keithian jurist of some standing, withdrew without explanation 3 days before ratification. The 9th candidate's appointment documentation had been filed in the tertiary registry rather than the primary. I did not look up when that last detail was read into the record. The 60-day window closed without a constituted panel. Under Article 7, Section 6, 3 pages past the section everyone had been reading, the failure to constitute a panel within the statutory window returned the dispute to the originating chamber for re-adjudication. The originating chamber was the full assembly. Re-adjudication required a new session. A new session required the full credentialed membership to be present and recognized, including the party in dispute, which meant that before the assembly could re-adjudicate our status, it had to formally recognize us as present, which temporarily restored our full standing for the duration of the session in which the re-adjudication was to occur. Dahl had been waiting for me to finish reading Section 6 the morning I found it. I finished. I looked up. She was already looking at the ceiling, the way she did when she was running something forward in her mind. "There's more," I said. She looked at me. I turned to the instrument I had pulled the night before and set it in front of her. The Assembly's Internal Sovereignty Charter, the document that governed its own authority to convene, adjudicate, and bind its member states, required renewal every 40 years. The last renewal had occurred in Session 89. Session 91 was the renewal session. Renewal required quorum. Quorum required the presence of credentialed permanent and associate members. The renewal vote had taken place in the second week of the session. While our credential status was technically still green, and our associate, standing uncontested, except the renewal instrument had not been formally enrolled, entered into the permanent record, until day 4 of the dispute period. Enrollment was a separate procedural act from the vote itself, formed by the Records Secretariat on a timeline the Assembly had allowed to slip in recent decades, because enrollment had for centuries been a formality. I was a records officer. I knew about enrollment timelines the way my mother knew about weld tolerances. You do not let them slip. The enrollment date on the renewal instrument fell inside the dispute period. During the dispute period, our associate status was contested. A contested associate member's presence could not be counted toward quorum for any instrument enrolled during the dispute window, a standing order that predated the current codex by 2 centuries and had never been superseded because no one had ever needed to supersede it. The sovereignty charter renewal, as enrolled, was procedurally void. The Assembly's authority to convene, adjudicate, and bind its member states lapsed every 40 years if the renewal failed. The next renewal window was 39 years away. Dahl read the instrument. She read it again. She set it down and was quiet for a long time. "How long have you had this?" she asked. "Day 9, I said. She looked at the ceiling again. Then she nodded. We brought the instrument to the re-adjudication session. Dahl presented it without preamble, stated that the human delegation wished to table a procedural notice regarding the enrollment record of the Sovereignty Charter Renewal Instrument, and sat back down. She read the relevant sections into the record in a flat voice, the way you read shipping clauses, not for effect but for accuracy. When she finished, she set the document on the table and folded her hands. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence I had heard in that chamber. Sorveth Oron's ridges fanned forward until they nearly touched. He held that position for some time, then with a deliberateness that I recognized as the deliberateness of a man who has understood something. "Cannot reverse," he called a 15-minute recess. The recess lasted 4 hours. When the chamber reconvened, the presiding voice announced that, following review of the procedural record, the Assembly Secretariat had identified an administrative irregularity in the original status nullification motion, specifically that the filing discrepancy, cite as its basis, had been reviewed and determined to fall within acceptable registry variance under Standing Order 11, which the motion had incorrectly characterized as a filing failure. Nullification was accordingly rescinded. The human delegation's associate status was restored, effective immediately, full retroactive standing for the dispute period. Dahl acknowledged the announcement. She said, "The delegation accepts the restoration." 6 words, that was all. She gathered her documents, capped her stylus, and picked up her water glass. She had not taken a sip from it all session. She drank now, slowly, finishing it, and set the glass back in its place on the right side. I gathered the record volumes and filed them by date, the way I always did. Neither of us said anything until we were in the corridor. The chamber doors closed behind us. The hall was long and pale and quiet, the kind of quiet that orbital platforms have when the ventilation runs smooth. "And there is nothing left. Decide day 9, Dahl said. Not a question. I wanted to be certain, I said. Shh. Section 6 needed the enrollment date confirmed against the Secretariat's filing log before the argument would hold. I requested the log on day 7. They sent the wrong volume. I submitted a corrected request on day 8. The right volume arrived on day 9. She absorbed that. And if they'd filed it correctly the first time, I would have had it on day 2. She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, more the sound of someone confirming a calculation they had suspected was right. We walked the length of the corridor. The fleet was visible through the long observation windows on our left. Our ships, holding position beyond the platform's authorized approach corridor, exactly where the transit authority had told them to stay. They had been there for 60 days, patient, orderly, present. They had never needed to be anything else. I had not needed them. The codex had been enough. The Kethian aide was standing near the far end of the corridor, watching us approach. He did not speak. As we drew level, he inclined his head. A small, precise gesture, the kind that carries weight without requiring translation. Dahl acknowledged it with the same. We walked on. They had built that codex to keep order in this part of the Reach for 900 years, and they had built it carefully and thoroughly and well. They had simply not anticipated that someone would read all of it before they walked in. We had been doing that, reading things carefully, all of them, cover to cover, appendix volumes included, for a very long time.